History remembers the Mongols as killers. We picture them as a relentless tide of horsemen burning cities to the ground and building gruesome pyramids of human skulls. And yes, they absolutely did that. The terror was real. But if you stop there, if you only see the destruction, you miss the real story. You miss one of the most incredible, world-changing events in human history. Because Genghis Khan didn't just conquer the world, he connected it. He and his descendants built the internet of the 13th century. They created a zone of safety so massive, so unprecedented, that it was said a virgin carrying a sack of gold could walk from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Black Sea without ever being harmed. This is the story of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. A peace forged in blood and fire, but one that paved the way for the very first global economy. Before the Mongols, the legendary Silk Road was mostly just a legend. In reality, it was a death trap. It wasn't a single road, but a fragmented, treacherous network of paths broken up by dozens of tiny kingdoms and warring tribes. Each one had its own greedy ruler, its own exorbitant taxes, its own local bandits, and its own petty wars. Trying to move goods was a nightmare. Trade was slow, it was prohibitively expensive, and it was incredibly dangerous. Most merchants never made it. Then came the horsemen. When the Mongol armies thundered into a city, their reputation preceded them. But what happened after the conquest is what truly changed the world. They didn't just loot it and leave, they integrated it. They absorbed it into a single unified system. For the first time in human history, the entire sprawling trade network of Asia was under one management. Imagine driving from Portugal all the way to Vietnam today without ever crossing a single border checkpoint. No passports, no customs, no different currencies. That's what the Mongol Empire felt like for a merchant in the 13th century. They slashed the crippling taxes that had strangled trade for centuries. They standardized weights and measures across the continent, so a pound of silk in China was still a pound of silk in Persia. They understood a profound truth that so many rulers before them had missed. Commerce, not plunder, was the true source of infinite wealth. But their greatest invention wasn't a weapon of war. It was a weapon of information. It was called the yam. Think of the Pony Express, but on a continental scale, supercharged with military discipline. Every 20 to 30 miles stretching across the vast plains and mountains of Asia, the Mongols built a relay station. At every single station, there were fresh, rested horses, hot food, and beds waiting. A Mongol rider carrying a specialized passport, a golden tablet called a paisa, was given absolute priority on the road. They could ride at a full gallop, swapping for a fresh mount at each station, covering up to 200 miles in a single day. Information that used to take months to travel now took mere days. Critical messages, military orders, and economic data flew across the empire at a speed that was almost supernatural for the time. The Great Khan, sitting in his capital in what is now Beijing, could know the price of grain in Baghdad before the local governors did. This incredible speed wasn't just for messages, it was the backbone of their entire economy. It allowed them to move resources, shift armies, and transfer money faster than anyone else on Earth. It was the logistics network that held the largest land empire in history together. Now, the Mongols were nomadic warriors. They grew up on horseback, not in classrooms. Many, including Genghis Khan himself, were illiterate, but they were not stupid. They were keenly aware of what they didn't know. They knew they couldn't run a complex, continent-spanning economy on their own, so they stole the people who could. What followed was perhaps the greatest brain drain in history. But it wasn't a drain in the modern sense. It was a forced relocation and redistribution of talent. If you were a brilliant accountant in Persia, a skilled engineer in China, a master silversmith in Russia, or a weaver in Damascus, you weren't just killed or enslaved. You were identified, valued, and hired. You were given a new job in the Mongol administration. They moved these experts around their empire like chess pieces, placing them where their skills were needed most. They brought Muslim financial administrators to China to completely overhaul the chaotic tax code. They sent Chinese engineers to the Middle East to build advanced irrigation systems and devastating siege weapons. They brought French goldsmiths to the Mongol capital of Karakorum. It was a forced cross-pollination of genius. Ideas, technologies, and cultures that had been separated by thousands of miles for centuries were suddenly thrown together. This created an economic and technological boom the world had never seen before. Gunpowder from China made its way to Europe. Persian astronomy and mathematics flourished in China. Italian merchants brought back the secrets of noodle making, which would eventually become pasta. By the middle of the 1200s, the Mongols had it all. They had the roads, they had the experts, they had the goods flowing from one end of the world to the other. But they had a huge, unexpected problem. As trade exploded, they started running out of the one thing they needed to pay for it all: money, specifically copper coins. The economy was growing too fast for the physical money supply to keep up. You can't just mine more copper overnight. Caravans were getting bigger, deals were getting larger, and hauling around tons and tons of metal coins was becoming impossible. The system that the Mongols had built was becoming a victim of its own success. They needed a new way to transact. They needed something lighter, something more abstract, something that could keep up with the speed of their new globalized world. They needed magic, and that magic would come from the mind of Genghis Khan's grandson, the great Kublai Khan. To understand this magic, let's travel back in time. Imagine you're a European merchant in the year 1275. You've journeyed thousands of miles across treacherous mountains and vast deserts, finally reaching the legendary markets of China. Your bags are heavy, filled with precious gold coins, ready to buy the finest silks the world has ever seen. You walk into a bustling shop, lay your gold on the counter, and make your offer. But the shopkeeper doesn't reach for the gold. He just laughs. He points at your coins like they're common rocks. Instead, he asks for a dirty, gray piece of paper. You're baffled. You think he must be completely insane. Why would anyone trade luxurious silk for a flimsy piece of paper? But then, he leans in and tells you something chilling. If you don't use this paper money, the emperor himself will have you killed. This was the profound shock that rippled through the world under the reign of Kublai Khan. The Mongols didn't just invent a new type of currency. They invented the very idea of money as a system of belief, a shared story backed by absolute power. So, who was this man who could turn paper into gold? Kublai Khan, the grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, ruled over the vast Yuan Dynasty in China. He commanded one of the largest empires in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. But despite his immense power, his empire was bleeding copper. China, a land of incredible wealth and innovation, simply could not mine enough metal to produce the coins needed for millions of daily transactions. The economy was facing a severe liquidity crisis. Trade was grinding to a halt. There was literally no cash to pay for goods and services. Faced with this economic paralysis, Kublai's advisors came to him with a solution so radical, so audacious, it would change the world forever. Their proposal was simple. Let's stop using value. Let's start using trust. And so the Chao was born. This wasn't money made from precious metal. It was crafted from the bark of the mulberry tree. The creation process was a state secret, carried out with extreme precision. The bark was treated, meticulously cut into uniform rectangles. And then, the crucial final step, it was stamped with the bright red seal of the great Khan himself. This seal was his personal guarantee, his promise to the people. And to make sure everyone took this promise seriously, a grim warning was printed in the corners of every single note. It read, "Counterfeiters will be decapitated." This wasn't an idle threat. The authority of the currency was absolute, enforced by the sword. Now, this wasn't the very first time paper money had appeared. China's earlier Song dynasty had experimented with it. But there was a critical difference. The Chao was the world's first true fiat currency. It was not backed by gold or silver. You couldn't walk into a government office and exchange your paper notes for a pile of precious metal. The Chao was money simply because the Khan declared it was money. Period. His word was law, and that law gave the paper its value. And incredibly, it worked. It worked beautifully. Almost overnight, the entire economic landscape of China was transformed. The government could suddenly pay its soldiers, its officials, and its builders without needing to mine a single ounce of copper. The people, especially merchants, loved it. Imagine the relief. Instead of hauling around 500 pounds of copper coins, heavy, cumbersome, and a magnet for bandits, they could now carry a fortune neatly folded in their pocket. The famous Venetian traveler, Marco Polo, who served in Kublai Khan's court for years, was absolutely stunned by what he saw. He wrote about it with a sense of wonder, describing how the Khan had seemingly mastered the ancient art of alchemy. He wrote, "With these pieces of paper, they can buy anything and pay for anything, and no one dares refuse it, on pain of death." To Marco Polo, it seemed like the Khan had discovered the secret to creating wealth out of absolutely nothing. Armed with this limitless credit card, Kublai Khan embarked on a series of monumental projects that reshaped China. He ordered the construction of the Grand Canal's northern extension, a breathtaking marvel of engineering that connected his new capital, Beijing, to the fertile agricultural heartlands of the south, securing the city's food supply for centuries. But he didn't stop there. He used this newfound wealth to create one of the world's first social safety nets. If a province was hit by a flood or a drought and crops failed, the government didn't just stand by. It printed money, bought grain from unaffected regions, and distributed it to the starving population. He became a great patron of the arts and sciences, funding advancements in astronomy, medicine, and literature. For a few glorious decades, it seemed like the perfect system. The state had infinite spending power to improve society, and the people had a stable, convenient currency to fuel the economy. However, there is a fundamental, unbreakable rule in economics. If you make it easy to create money, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop spending it. Kublai Khan was arguably the richest and most powerful man in the world. He had the ultimate power, the printing press. But he also had an ego to match his empire. He would stand on the shores of his domain, look across the sea towards the island nation of Japan, and think, I want that too. He was about to make one of the most expensive military mistakes in all of history, and he was going to pay for it all with simple pieces of paper. How much does a failed war cost? Today, we're not talking about lives or territory, we're talking about money. Hard cash, or in this case, paper cash. This is the story of how the most powerful empire on earth printed itself into oblivion. It's a tale of typhoons, palaces, and the simple, brutal math of inflation. Our story begins in 1274. The Mongol Empire, under Kublai Khan, is at its absolute peak. They control everything from Korea to Hungary. What's left? Well, across the sea, there's Japan. And Kublai wants it. So, he decides to invade. This isn't just a few boats. He orders the construction of a massive fleet, thousands of ships. He hires tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers. And how does he pay for all this? He prints money, millions and millions of paper notes called Chao. This was one of the world's first experiments with fiat currency, money backed not by silver or gold, but by the full faith and credit of the government. The fleet sets sail. It's a terrifying sight. But then, something happens that no one could predict. A massive typhoon, which the Japanese would later call the kamikaze, or divine wind, smashes the Mongol fleet to pieces. An entire army, an entire navy, gone. Now, most empires would take a moment. They'd lick their wounds, maybe reconsider the whole invading Japan idea. But Kublai Khan was a Mongol, and the Mongols didn't give up. More importantly, they had a secret weapon, a printing press. So he did it again. He ordered a second, even bigger fleet. He recruited an even larger army. And to pay for it, he fired up the printing presses and printed even more money. The second fleet set sail, and guess what happened? Another typhoon. Another fleet, an even greater investment of wealth and manpower, sent to the bottom of the sea. Most leaders would have been ruined. But the Mongols thought they had a cheat code. They believed they could just print their way out of any problem, even a defeat of this magnitude. This is where our story really begins. This is the story of how an addiction to spending, fueled by a seemingly endless supply of paper money, broke the most powerful economic system in the world. To understand why they kept printing, you need to understand how the Mongol Empire had changed. The original Mongols under Genghis Khan were hardened warriors who lived in the saddle and slept in yurts. They conquered, they took plunder, and they moved on. But Kublai Khan's generation was different. They weren't nomads anymore. They were bureaucrats. They lived in lavish palaces in their new capital, Dadu, modern-day Beijing. And palaces, my friends, are expensive. The Yuan court was bloated. We're talking thousands of officials, countless concubines, eunuchs, and hangers-on, all living a life of incredible luxury, all on the government's payroll. But the biggest expense wasn't the palaces. It was keeping the other Mongol princes happy. Back on the steppes of Mongolia, the traditional Mongol nobility was getting restless. To keep them loyal, Kublai Khan's court sent them a constant stream of massive gifts, silk, jewels, and cash. Let's call it what it was. Bribery, and it cost a fortune. In the early days of the Yuan Dynasty, they paid for all this with taxes collected from the vast population of China. But as the court's expenses grew and the bribes got bigger, taxes weren't enough. They started dipping into the reserves, the actual silver and silk that was supposed to back their paper currency. Slowly but surely, the ratio of paper money in circulation to actual goods in the vaults began to skew. The invasions of Japan were the tipping point. An amphibious assault on that scale had not been seen before and wouldn't be seen again until D-Day in World War II. The cost was astronomical. In modern terms, we're talking about the equivalent of trillions of dollars. Think about what it takes. Entire forests in Korea and China had to be felled to build the ships. Shipbuilders, craftsmen, and laborers had to be paid. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to be equipped, fed, and housed for months, even years. All of this was paid for with paper money. When those fleets sank, all of that real wealth, the wood, the iron, the grain, the labor, didn't just magically return to the Chinese economy. It was gone. It was at the bottom of the ocean. But the paper notes that paid for it, they were still very much in circulation, floating around the markets of China. This is a classic economic scenario called demand-pull inflation. You have way too much money chasing way too few goods. When a ship sinks, the wood and iron are gone. The food the soldiers ate is gone. The real, tangible stuff of the economy has been destroyed. But the paper claims on that stuff, they still exist. Suddenly, everyone has cash, but the total amount of things to buy has shrunk. What happens? Prices go up. And it wasn't just Japan. The spending was relentless. Kublai tried to invade Java, which is modern-day Indonesia. It failed. He launched multiple campaigns to subdue Vietnam. They all failed. Each failure was another economic body blow. The soldiers died, the ships were lost, the supplies were consumed, but the debt in the form of paper money remained. To cover these ever-growing deficits, the Yuan government did what desperate governments have always done throughout history. They reformed the currency. In 1287, they issued a new paper note, the new Chao, and they declared that one of these new notes was worth 5 of the old notes. This is a classic devaluation. In effect, the government was telling everyone, that money you saved, it's now worth only 20% of what it was yesterday. They were robbing the savers, the merchants, and the common people to pay for the soldiers and the failed wars. They were sacrificing the long-term stability of their economy for a short-term cash injection. With so much easy money flowing from the printing presses, something else predictable happened. Corruption exploded. The finance ministers, men like the infamous Ahmad Fanakadi, became less like public servants and more like mob bosses. They used their control of the printing press to enrich themselves and their friends. They created state monopolies on things like salt and iron, then sold the licenses to their cronies for exorbitant prices. They would outright confiscate the goods of successful merchants under flimsy pretexts. All of this began to erode the single most important thing that makes fiat currency work: trust. People started to realize the paper in their hands was losing value every single day. So they did what people always do in this situation. They started hoarding real assets. They took their silver coins and copper pots and buried them under the floorboards. They tried to get rid of their paper money as fast as they could, buying anything tangible before the price went up again tomorrow. This, of course, just made the inflation even worse. By the time Kublai Khan died in 1294, the cracks in the system were visible to everyone. Prices for basic goods were spiraling upwards, and the common people, who lived on fixed incomes or worked for wages, were suffering terribly. There was widespread grumbling and unrest. But the system, the great Mongol machine, was still holding together, just barely. The Mongol court was still living in its bubble of luxury, convinced it could print its way to prosperity. They were prepared for war, they were prepared for rebellion, but they weren't prepared for what came next. Because nature has a way of kicking an empire when it's down. The Mongols were about to face an enemy they couldn't fight with an army and couldn't pay off with paper money. The Mongols were ready for a war, but they weren't ready for a plague. Imagine it's the year 1350. You're in Dadu, modern-day Beijing, the capital of the Mongol Empire in China. You push a wheelbarrow piled high with paper money to the market, and the vendor just laughs. He won't even trade it for a single bag of rice. The streets are literally littered with cash, blowing around like worthless confetti. The Mongol government, once the master of the world, is in full-blown panic. Their solution? Just print more money. They keep adding zeros, printing notes with ever higher denominations, desperately trying to keep up with the chaos they've created. Then the whispers start. People are getting sick. Strange black boils appear on their necks and in their armpits. A fever takes hold, followed by a terrifying cough that brings up blood. The economy was already on life support, gasping for air. The Black Death just walked in and pulled the plug. How did it come to this? How did the unstoppable Mongol war machine, the empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Danube, crumble into dust and disease? The story is a chilling lesson, and it all starts with a simple, seductive idea: the power of the printing press. Let's rewind a bit. When Kublai Khan, grandson of the great Genghis, established the Yuan Dynasty in China, he inherited something truly revolutionary: paper money. The Chinese had been using it for centuries, but Kublai took it to a whole new level. He made it the only legal currency. All gold and silver had to be turned over to the government in exchange for these paper notes called Chao. At first, it was a stroke of genius. It was lightweight, easy to carry, and it unified the vast empire under one economic system. Marco Polo was blown away. He wrote about how the great Khan could basically create wealth out of the bark of mulberry trees. It was like magic. This system worked as long as the government was responsible. As long as people trusted that the paper in their hands could be exchanged for something of real value, the magic held. But after Kublai Khan died in 1294, the magic began to fade. His successors lacked his charisma, his authority, and his discipline. They were surrounded by factions, court intrigue, and constant power struggles. And they faced a recurring problem. They always wanted to spend more than they had. Military campaigns, lavish palaces, a bloated bureaucracy, it all cost money, lots of it. Every time they faced a budget shortfall, they turned to the easiest solution they could find. They didn't raise taxes, which was unpopular. They didn't cut spending, which was unthinkable. They just ordered the printing presses to run. A little at first, then more, then a flood. They were essentially creating money out of thin air to pay their bills. What they failed to understand, or perhaps chose to ignore, is that you can print money, but you can't print value. By the 1340s, the situation was spinning out of control. The value of the paper money plummeted. Prices for everyday goods like rice and salt skyrocketed, sometimes doubling in a single day. A note that was once worth a fortune could barely buy a meal. This wasn't just economic inflation, it became psychological. The moment the people, the farmers, the merchants, collectively decided that this paper was worthless, it became worthless. The government's promise was broken. Trust had evaporated. Merchants, who were the lifeblood of the Mongol Silk Road, started refusing to accept the paper notes. Why would you trade valuable silk or spices for paper that would be worth even less tomorrow? Shopkeepers closed their doors. Hoarding became rampant. The entire sophisticated trade network that had defined the Pax Mongolica, that golden age of peace and commerce, ground to a screeching halt. Nobody knew what anything cost anymore. The economic engine of the empire had seized, and just when it seemed things couldn't possibly get any worse, they did. The plague arrived. The Black Death. It traveled along the very same trade routes the Mongols had built and protected, a cruel irony. It hitched a ride on fleas, on rats, on merchants' caravans, moving from Central Asia right into the heart of China. The pandemic that would later devastate Europe began here, in an empire already rotting from the inside. The scale of the death was apocalyptic. Historians estimate it killed 30% to 50% of the population in some regions, perhaps even more. Think about that. 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you knew, gone. Villages were wiped out. Cities became ghost towns. The effect on the economy was catastrophic. Agriculture collapsed. There was no one left to plant the crops, no one to harvest the wheat. Famine followed pestilence. And what about the government? Their tax base literally evaporated. You can't tax dead people, but the emperor in his palace still had bills to pay. He still had an army that expected to be fed. He still had officials demanding their salaries. So, in a moment of what can only be described as total insanity, the government's response was to double down. They tried to enforce the use of the worthless paper money even more strictly. They issued decrees, making it a crime not to accept it. But you cannot enforce a law when the police and soldiers are dying of the plague just like everyone else. The state was losing its monopoly on violence, its very ability to govern. Hunger and grief make people fearless. The Chinese peasantry had been squeezed for decades. They had watched their life savings be stolen by inflation, turned into useless paper. Now, they were watching their families die of a horrifying disease while the Mongol elite, their foreign rulers, hid away in their palaces, seemingly immune to the suffering. The social contract was not just broken, it was shattered into a million pieces. This was the fertile ground where rebellion grew. A religious sect, blending Buddhist and Manichaean beliefs, rose up. They were known as the Red Turbans, for the red headbands they wore. Their leader, a peasant monk named Zhu Yunzhang, was an orphan whose entire family had been killed by famine and plague. He had nothing left to lose. And the Red Turbans weren't just another protest movement. They didn't want to just change the government. They wanted to erase the Yuan Dynasty from history. They preached of a coming apocalypse and the restoration of a native Chinese dynasty. Their message resonated with millions of desperate people. The Mongol army, unpaid, underfed, and demoralized, simply crumbled. They were a shadow of the invincible force that had conquered the world. The Red Turban rebels captured city after city, and what was the first thing they did when they took over a town? They went straight to the government offices. They burned the tax records. They burned the official documents. And they made a huge bonfire of the worthless paper money. It was a powerful symbolic act, a complete rejection of the Mongol system. By 1368, it was all over. The last Yuan emperor, Togon Timur, fled Beijing without a fight. He retreated back to the Mongolian steppes, the homeland his ancestors had left a century before. The greatest land empire in history had lasted less than a century in China. The dream of Genghis Khan was dead. Zhu Yunzhang, the peasant orphan, became the Hongwu emperor, founding the new Ming dynasty. And one of his very first orders of business? He completely abolished paper money. The trauma of the hyperinflation was so deep that China would not trust paper currency again for nearly 500 years. The new dynasty went back to basics, silver and bronze coins. They also turned inward. They closed the borders, restricted foreign trade, and rebuilt the Great Wall. The era of the Silk Road and global trade initiated by the Mongols was over. China looked inward, suspicious of the outside world that had brought them plague and economic ruin. The fall of the Mongol. His Yuan Dynasty is more than just a dusty chapter in a history book. It's a lesson that is terrifyingly modern. It proves that while a state can create an infinite amount of money, it cannot create infinite value. The Mongols built an economic miracle on a foundation of trust. But when they abused that trust, printing money to solve all their problems, the miracle turned into a nightmare of hyperinflation, collapse, and revolution. Genghis Khan conquered the world on horseback. His grandsons lost it with a printing press. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. History often repeats itself, and understanding the past might just be the best way to prepare for the future. See you in the next video.